Hello viewers, and welcome to the session on Psalm 23. Psalms is a book in the Bible. The Bible is divided into two parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. There are 73 books in the canon of the Catholic Bible, 46 in the Old Testament and 27 in the New Testament. The book of Psalms is one of the 46 books of the Old Testament in the Bible. A psalm is a religious poem or a song set to music. Some of the psalms in the book of Psalms are hymns to be sung by a congregation and songs of accent to be sung by pilgrims approaching the temple. Some are private prayers and some are lyrical devices for recalling historical events in Israel's history. In its current form, the book of Psalms contains 150 individual psalms, although this number may vary in different biblical translations. The Greek word is psalmos, from the Hebrew word zmur, meaning to pluck, that is, taking hold of the strings of an instrument with the fingers. It implies that psalms were originally composed to be accompanied by a stringed instrument. Psalms are songs for the lyre, and therefore lyric poems in the strictest sense. David and others therefore originally wrote the Psalms to be sung to the accompaniment of the harp. The writing of the Psalms reached its peak during the time of David. The earliest psalm was written by Moses. Traditionally, the Psalms are separated into 5 books. Book 1 comprises Psalms 1 to 41, Book 2 comprises 42 to 72, Book 3 Psalm 73 to 89, Book 4, Psalm 90 to 106, and Book 5, 107 to 150. And many poems are further distinguished by brief titles attributing the given work to a specific author, though these titles were probably added to a later date by an editor or group of editors of the Psalms, because the subject matter of the Psalms ranges from the events of King David's dynasty to the exile of the Israelites in Babylon. The poems may have been composed anywhere from the 10th century BC to the 6th century BC or later. Many of the Psalms rehearse episodes of Israel's history, especially the story of Israel's exodus from Egypt and its arrival in the Promised Land. The authors of the Psalms are David, Asaph, the sons of Korah, Solomon, Moses, Heman, and Ethan. David has written 73 psalms, Asaph 12, sons of Korah 12, Solomon 2, Moses 1, Heman and Ethan 1 each, and others are 48 which are anonymous. The various styles of the psalms are didactic, psalms of teaching and instruction, for example Psalm 1. Liturgical psalms, responsive readings for use in special services, for example Psalm 136. Meditation, the ancient Hebrew was given to meditation, so which spirit finds expression in the Psalms, for example Psalm 119. Praise and devotion, psalms of joyful praise, for example Psalm 148. Prayer and devotion, psalms which were sung in an attitude of prayer, for example Psalm 51. A majority of the biblical psalms are devoted to expressing praise or thanksgiving to God. Psalm 8, for instance, is a communal or public declaration of praise to God for His relationship with creation. Another category of psalms includes laments and supplication, in which the poet moves from despair over his own wrongdoing to a profession of deeper faith in God. Other psalms are deeply personal poems that offer hope of redemption for the individual. The poet decries his spiritual despair using metaphors similar to the Psalms of Lament. In Psalm 23, the poet walks through dark valleys. Psalms devoted to wisdom use proverbs or catchy phrases, rhetorical devices, in order to give moral instructions to the reader. Now, why are we focusing on Psalm 23? The objective here is to remind ourselves of the wonderful provision, protection, and preservation the Lord furnishes for His people. We want to note how the psalm foreshadows the blessings provided by the Good Shepherd, Jesus Christ. We wish to bring forth our fears in prayer and overcome them through faith. We wish to help our students appreciate the characteristics of Greek poetry. We want to develop an appreciation and working knowledge of the Psalms, and then to glean a clearer picture of God's character. The Lord is my shepherd is the opening sentence in Psalm 23, is a pastoral psalm built around the motive of the daily acts of provision that a good shepherd performs for his sheep. The sheep-shepherd relationship in turn is a metaphor for the providence that God extends to his followers. At the sheep-shepherd level, the sequence of provision is as follows. The controlling metaphor and theme is established in verse 1. Midday resting in an oasis after morning feeding and drinking is established in verses 2 and 3a. His guidance in safe paths, verse 3b. Protection through dangerous parts of the journey over the path in verse 4. Provision of grazing in verse 5a. Caring for injured sheep in the sheepfold at the end of the day, verse 5b. And prediction that the sheep are always assured of returning to the sheepfold at the end of the day in verse 6. When we carry over the meanings of provisions to the human level, we delight in the comprehensiveness of God's provision for those who follow him. God is a faithful shepherd. He provides for us without sparing a single detail. He guides us into righteous life for the sake of his own reputation, and he protects us, not by shielding us from difficulty, though he does at times, but by permitting in our lives only what is beneficial to us according to his good purpose for us. We need to trust him as our good shepherd and faithful shepherd. Our academic script, we will now just have an introduction to the psalm. We live in a world in which many, if not most people, are engulfed with fear and anxiety. Some fear the future. They are anxious about what is going to happen. Others fear the past, and they are anxious about what has happened, and still others fear even the present. Anxiety has gripped their souls, and they cannot imagine how they can cope with the ugliness of present circumstances in their lives. Thousands of people each day wake up with untold burdens to bear and anxiety with which they must deal. The question then becomes, how does God want me to respond to the anxiety in my life? Well, like all great questions of life, Scripture affords us an answer from the life of David. David says, by way of an example in Psalm 23, that there is a constructive, God-honoring way to respond to anxiety in our lives. He says that we should trust God as a good and faithful shepherd and rejoice in his grace. Now it must be said that responding to God in this way will not necessarily solve our problems, but God will provide confidence as to what he is doing in your life. He will convince you, as he did David, that it is he who is leading you and your life. He is the one who is in control of all the details and circumstances. This will lead to greater peace and knowledge that we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. The psalm has two basic divisions, each one providing part of the answer to our question about worry. The first 4 verses focus on God as the faithful and good shepherd of his people. It calls us to trust him as such. The second section is made of the last 2 verses, focuses our attention on God as a gracious host, preparing a splendid meal for a guest, and results in our rejoicing over his grace towards us. Verse 1 is the introduction. Verses 2 and 3 depict abundant life. Verse 4 illustrates secure life. Verse 5 depicts the blessed life. And verse 6 is a picture of an intimate life dwelling in God's house. Let's talk about David. David is the author of the Psalm 23. David is a strong but unassuming shepherd who becomes God's choice to replace Saul as the king of Israel. He is humble yet self-possessed, readily dismissing human opinion. His humility becomes clear early in his youth when he kills the giant Goliath with a sling stone, declining the opportunity to use Saul's royal armor. As king, his foremost quality is obedience to God. For example, when his wife expresses embarrassment at David's dancing while he marches into Jerusalem, he rebukes her, boasting that he embarrasses himself so long as it pleases God. David's mercy to others displays his selflessness, a product of his strenuous commitment to ethical details. His sense of respectability is striking when he refrains to kill Saul, while Saul has his back turned because he feels it would be morally wrong to strike God's current anointed ruler. As king, David forgives the kingdom's traitors and executes the traitors of his enemies. When his own rebellious son dies, David cries aloud in public, "O my son Absalom, O my son Absalom." His weeping suggests the depth of a father's blind love for his son. David may be considered a pragmatist, one who acts not out of his or her ideals, but on the basis of what is practical or expedient. His mercy may be interpreted as a product of his political aspirations. David was a man just like we are. He was tempted to fret over his life on many occasions, not the least of which was the time when Saul was seeking his life. This forms the background of the psalm. David overcame sinful worry by trusting and rejoicing in God. Psalm 23 provides a model for us, a paradigm to be followed throughout our lives as we respond to all the difficulties and worries that come our way. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Verses 1 to 3 focus on two aspects. There is no lack of physical necessities. There is no lack of spiritual necessities. Focusing in on God's provision first, we see three things emerge from the text. First, God is a personal shepherd. It is as if David was saying that he knew that the God of the universe was personal to him and in control, as a good shepherd of his whole life. The result of this, according to David, was the knowledge that he lacked nothing. Like a good shepherd, Yahweh gives himself to us, and therefore we really lack nothing. Can we fail to trust a God who has so willingly made himself available to us? Second, we see in verse 2 that God's provision is perfect. David says that a good shepherd leads his sheep to green pastures and quiet waters. The green pastures probably refer to the tender young shoots that grow up in the morning and are loved by the wildlife of Palestine. The psalmist wants us to understand that this shepherd goes all out for his sheep. The shepherd wants them to have the best and is likewise sensitive to their needs. David wants us to understand that Yahweh does the same for his people. It was David's experience and it ought to be ours. Some of us have deep struggles with our present financial situation, a job situation, as well as other things. But we need to come to grips with the truth that as we seek God, we are not getting second best from Him. God is a faithful shepherd who gives us only what is excellent, according to His own purpose and agenda. Third, God's provision renews and satisfies. David goes on to say that as we go through life, God guides us as a good shepherd along the path of righteousness. Therefore, we may say that the green pastures and quiet waters provided by so caring a shepherd are for the physical nourishment and energy of the sheep. The shepherd literally revives the life of the sheep under his care. For the sheep, of course, it means they are certain to lead to the place of rest and provision talked about in verse 2. But for David, God desired to lead him down paths of uprightness during his kingship and enabled him to win great battles in his commission to possess the land promised to the nation. God desires to lead us into greater righteousness in our lives as well. The end of verse 3 gives the reason why God is such a faithful shepherd to David and still is for us today. He does it for his own name's sake. That is, it is God's nature to be faithful and loving. Rather than worry ourselves to death, why not trust God only for what He can provide? God's faithful provision is only part of what He does for those who know Him and love Him. What kind of reputation would a shepherd in Palestine earn if he was careless and irresponsible with his own sheep? God wants to show the world that He is faithful to provide for all our needs and guide us in righteous paths, but the shepherd must also protect his sheep. Psalm 23 verse 4 and 5 focus on the shepherd's protection. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. The phrase valley of the shadow of death most likely refers to the deep ravines with sharp cliffs, and it was not at all uncommon in Palestine for a shepherd to have to travel through one of those dark ravines where danger was imminent, either from the cliffs themselves or from animals hiding and waiting for their prey, in order to get another food source. David says, "And so it is with life." We often travel through what happens or what appears to be dangerous circumstances. Perhaps David is thinking of the attempts made on his life by Saul and others. But we need not be overcome by fear, for as the shepherd is with us and is able to ward off any danger by his rod and staff, so God is powerful enough to protect us from danger. God is a faithful shepherd. He has only permitted what in His wisdom is ultimately good for us and will never allow permanent separation to come between us and Him. We can trust Him to protect us from everything He does not desire for our lives. David's example also encourages us to rejoice in God's grace or unmerited favor to us. Let us look at verse 5. The picture here is of God as a gracious host, throwing a banquet as it were, sparing no extravagance for the invited guest. David says, "My cup overflows," which could either mean the quality of the drink is absolutely superb or that the host has provided him with abundance. Either way, the tremendous grace of God is evident in David's experience here. The implication in verse 5 is that this has been David's experience of being chosen and the anointed one with Yahweh up to this point in his life. And verse 6 seems to indicate that David is confident that such grace and fellowship with God will continue throughout all his days. And this is the focus of verse 6, the shepherd's preservation. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Rejoice in God's grace, for it results in constant fellowship with Him. Yahweh is a gracious person. In verse 6 he says, "Surely Notice David's confidence. Goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. Rather than being pursued by his enemies, for example Saul, the goodness and mercy, that is God's loving kindness of God, will follow him all his days. And he knows that he will dwell in the house of the Lord for as long as he lives. David envisions the direction his life will take as centered on fellowship and communion with God. The psalmist is secure in the knowledge of the love of the omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent God for eternity. He feels blessed by God's mercy and goodness. Let us now look at some of the poetic elements in Psalm 23. There's something rich about the characteristics of Hebrew poetry. Some of the things that make Hebrew poetry different from English poetry are: 1. The use of thought rhyme, also known as parallelism. The poet of the Psalms consistently uses parallelism to enhance his meaning. Unlike Roman poetry, in which rhythm and meter are structured around a pattern of stressed syllables, biblical poetry is largely based on pairings of versets, segments or halves of verses and lines, usually only a handful of words long. These versets parallel each other, and the second verse reiterating or expanding upon the ideas of the first verse. For example, I will fear no evil. The effect, for you are with me. The cause. Another example, your rod and your staff. The cause, they comfort me. The effect. The second aspect of Hebrew poetry is a lack of poetic rhythm. And the third is the use of figurative examples. The figure must be accepted and dealt with as a figure of speech, not as a literal statement. For example, in Psalm 23 verse 1, the Lord is called my shepherd, which means he is like a shepherd but not one literally. The figure must be interpreted in the light of its meaning, in the setting in which it is used. Verse 4 in Psalm 23 says, the valley of the shadow of death. It is not uncommon to hear the phrase applied at funerals to the act of dying. In the setting of the psalm, however, it refers to a treacherous place, such as a deep valley where deep shadows can easily cause a misstep resulting in death, where the guiding hand of a shepherd would be very helpful to sheep to avoid death. It is therefore applicable to any time one is in perilous state and in the need of God's guiding hand. What are the poetic elements that David uses in Psalm 23? 1. The metaphor. A comparison. A metaphor is a comparison between two things without the use of the word like and or as. To say A is B. That is, when you use two nouns to compare and contrast them to one another without using like or as in the given comparison, the Lord is my shepherd. The controlling metaphor in the psalm is one of a shepherd herding his sheep to safety. Imagery is another poetic element that David uses in his psalm. The use of words to paint pictures evoking a concrete sensory experience of people, places, and things. For example, verse 2 in Psalm 23, he makes me lie down in green pastures. The poet uses the following imagery: green pastures, still waters, dark valley, the shepherd's rod and staff. Personification is another poetic element, a figure of speech in which an inanimate object or abstraction is endowed with human qualities or abilities. In Psalm 23 verses 1 to 6, the characteristics of the children of God are applied to sheep, led by the shepherd through green pasture. The sheep graze in order to restore their energy, while the children of God have their souls restored. The sheep rest near a silent body of water, while the children of God live in peace and harmony in the presence of God. So Psalm 23 actually teaches us that there is a God-honoring way to respond to anxiety in life. Rather than worrying, we can trust God and rejoice. He is in control of all the details and circumstances of our lives. I am confident as to what He is doing in my life. I hope by listening and learning Psalm 23, you too become as confident as to what God is doing in your life. Thank you.